So again, postmodernism is really rooted in the idea of pluralism or multiplicity, acknowledging that there is no one right way to doing or being. And then the 1960s through the early 2000s really was truly an era of socio-political unrest and activism. Postmodern art becomes increasingly concerned with highlighting and exploring social issues and a multiplicity of ethnicities, genders, and sexualities. They look at who has been included in the canon and who hasn't, and really start to think about how to rectify that and how to address the social issues and concerns of a multicultural world. Certainly, the art of the civil rights movement in the 1960s and 70s and the women's liberation movement of the 1970s were in this direction as they were trying to open up the canon which had been dominated by white men. Building on these models of asserting identity, others made art addressing racial and ethnic difference and began to explore the topic of gender broadly to consider its relationship with sexual identity and orientation. Individuals who had once stayed or been forced to stay on the edges of society and the art establishment began to instead claim center stage by making work that confronts issues of identity and unequal treatment based on gender, sexual orientation, race, and class. So the women's liberation movement of the 1960s and 70s really paralleled a call within the art world for greater recognition of female artists, both past and present. Research revealed that even though women had regularly contributed to the development of Western art, they were rarely mentioned in its written history. Female art historians began uncovering their legacies and expanding the canon to include their stories. In 1971, feminist art historian Linda Noklin published her essay, "Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists?" And this is what you'll read for your final reading response. But her essay credits the lack of women in art history as systemic within a patriarchal society. Noklin argued that women could never be described as great because the standard of greatness was defined by a canon that favored men. She points out that throughout history, women have been denied access to art education and opportunities that were readily available for men, effectively making competition on equal terms impossible. For women to be acknowledged as great artists, the conditions of the canon and the art system had to be changed. And this is exactly what the feminist artists of the 1970s and onward were seeking to do. Feminist artists used a variety of art forms, often experimental art forms like conceptual and performance art, to try and escape the male-dominated traditional art forms like painting and sculpture, in which women commonly appeared as passive objects of sexual desire created by and for men. Many were interested in essentialist ideas of feminism that defined female experience in terms of the biological difference between women and men. They created imagery based on female anatomy, explored taboo topics like menstruation and reproduction, and used their own bodies as both subject and medium. Many examined traditional female gender roles and explored craft and decorative arts that were historically employed by women as sources of female empowerment. All in all, feminist art seeks to critique the social, political, and art historical frameworks that maintain the systematic oppression of women. Now, two prominent feminist artists that we're going to talk about from the 1970s were Judy Chicago and Miriam Schapiro. So here I've included an earlier drawing by Judy Chicago, who was actually born as Judy Garowitz, and she adopted the name of her birth city to free herself from what she called, quote, all names imposed upon her through male societal dominance. Her early work is rather minimalist, with a heavy emphasis on the perfection of surface through the erasure of the artist's hand and a mastery of materials. In 1960s, she started making abstracted images based on female genitalia, like this here, and she called these core female images or imagery. But she wanted to emphasize sexual difference, to challenge the male-dominated art world, and to assert the value of the female experience. In the early 1970s, Judy Chicago moved to LA, where she joined Miriam Schapiro, another feminist artist, to establish the first feminist art program at Cal Arts. In 1971 and 72, Chicago, Shapiro, and 21 female students created Woman House, a collaborative art environment in an empty Hollywood mansion that they renovated and filled with feminist installations and performances. The goal of the project was to address the relationship between biology and social roles. And I think, at least in part, these artists were responding to Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, which had sold more than 1 million copies in 1964. In the book, Friedan challenged the widely shared belief in the 1950s that fulfillment as a woman had only one definition for American women after 1949, the housewife mother. Friedan created the phrase feminine mystique to point out the assumptions that women should not have wanted to work, get an education, or have political opinions, but should be fulfilled from their housework, marriage, sexual lives, and children. Friedan wanted to prove that women were unsatisfied, but they could not really voice their feelings. And with Woman House, Chicago, Shapiro, and their students really illustrated this sentiment through installations and performances that represented women in conventional domestic roles within the home, but simultaneously challenged the meaning of the room and the activity in relation to women's self-image. As Miriam Shapiro recalled in 1987, she said, "Our purpose was to remake the old house into a place of dreams and fantasies. Each room would be transformed into a non-functioning art environment." Additionally, art historian Tema Balducci writes, "The artists who produced Woman House used parody and exaggeration as tools to undermine essentialist stereotypes about women that limited them to domestic roles, making it one of the earliest feminist artworks to question the boundaries between essential and constructed meaning." So viewers would wind their way through this home, confronted and challenged by parodies of social expectations. In Shoe Closet by Beth Bockenheimer, for instance, viewers encountered a closet packed with painted high-heel shoes, suggesting the transformation of woman from subject to object as a housewife who must continually change her costume and mask for her husband's pleasure. In Nurturant Kitchen by Suzanne Fraser, Vicki Hodgetts, and Robin Welsh, the colored lighting created a pink aura that bathed the kitchen space. Resembling a factory assembly line, plates of food were lined up under the light bulbs to suggest the dehumanizing of women's role as nurturer. The ceiling and walls were covered with sculptured fried eggs that gradually transform into breasts as they come down the walls. And then aprons were covered with female body parts that could be physically removed when done with housework, indicating that a woman's body is inextricably connected to her societal role. Visitors encountered Faith Wilding's Womb Room, which consisted of crochet webs that draped the room from floor to ceiling. Meanwhile, Sandra Orgel built a female mannequin into a linen closet, her body oppressively interrupted at the neck, chest, and torso by shelves. And in Judy Chicago's installation Menstruation Bathroom, a trash bin overflowed with bloody pads, drenched Kotex liners hung from a clothesline, and used tampons were strewn about, among other shock-inducing menstrual accoutrements. The mansion would eventually be demolished, but for a short window of time, these women converted its 17 rooms into a showcase for their installations, sculptures, textiles, and performances. But it was also a place where they could engage in probing group sessions about femininity, domesticity, patriarchy, oppression, and more through artworks that juxtaposed ideas of beauty, comfort, and safety associated with the home with the terrors of domestic confinement, oppression, and abuse. Woman House was revolutionary in that it was the first widely experienced survey of feminist art during a time when women were largely disregarded by museums and mainstream art institutions. So for Woman House, Miriam Shapiro, in collaboration with another artist, Sherry Brody, contributed Doll House, an elaborate mixed media construction of several miniature rooms adorned with richly patterned fabrics, essentially creating this home within a home. Shapiro then went on to create a type of work that incorporated pieces of fabric with acrylic paintings. She called these femage, from female in collage. Her 1974 personal appearance number 3 is characteristic of her femage works because it celebrates traditional women's crafts with a formal and emotional richness that was really meant to counter the male-dominated minimalist aesthetic that was so popular at the time. Shapiro later became a prominent leader in the pattern and decoration movement, a New York-based group of artists who merged the aesthetics of abstraction with decorative motifs derived from women's craft arts, folk art, and art beyond the Western tradition. Sort of similarly, Judy Chicago continued to explore how hundreds, if not thousands, of women and female artists had been forgotten or omitted completely from history. Between 1974 and 79, with the help of some 400 other artists and volunteers, Chicago created the Dinner Party, a huge mixed-media installation dedicated to rescuing hundreds of women and female artists from anonymity. The dinner party consists of 3 large tables, each about 48 feet long, arranged in an equilateral triangle, which is a long-standing symbol of fairness and equality, but also an ancient symbol of women and mother goddesses. The tables are set with a total of 39 place settings, each representing different women of historical significance. Each of the 3 tables has 13 settings, 13 being the number of men who were present at the Last Supper and the number of witches required to form an official coven. The tables of the dinner party sit on a white porcelain tiled floor that displays the names of an additional 999 women in gold script. So each place setting includes a 14-inch porcelain plate decorated with what Chicago referred to as core female imagery. So these are abstracted forms that are evocative of female genitalia, which Chicago intended as sort of powerful symbols of how femininity is often both revered and feared at the same time. Although she also related these forms to butterflies, sort of symbolizing liberation. So, for example, this is the Georgia O'Keeffe plate. The porcelain plates were painted using China paints, which were an acceptable creative hobby for women in the 18th and 19th centuries. Women ordered blank porcelain objects from manufacturers and then decorated them, and by the 1890s, more than 25,000 American women engaged in China painting. These women were labeled as amateur artists or lady amateurs, which really reinforced the historical hierarchy of arts that was already in place. The stereotype was furthered by arguments that China painting was particularly adapted for the female mind and hand because of its traditional content, such as flowers, animals, or simple patterns. Additionally, China painting also required a certain neatness and patience, which were 2 virtues that women were sort of expected to embody. The imagery and ideas of the plates extend onto the handmade fabric placemats, which are embroidered with the name of a famous historical or mythological woman. Chicago and her partners used fabrics, patterns, stitching, and techniques that were appropriate to the period in which they represented the woman, in the period that the woman represented was from. So again, this is the Georgia O'Keeffe plate, which uses these sort of rich, varied tones of pink and lavender and kind of a darker purple and then a sort of brown. And then those colors are sort of repeated in the embroidered runner as well. But again, kind of evocative of female genitalia, maybe also a butterfly in some ways, but they're also trying to relate, the forms and the colors to the woman that the plate and the placemat are meant to represent. So in this case, they are thinking about Georgia O'Keeffe's abstracted flower paintings and kind of using those as inspiration for the form on the plate. Here's another example. This is the Emily Dickinson plate, which impresses a sort of decorative and feminine, even somewhat kitschy tone with its finely carved lace pattern and soft, fleshy colors. here we have a Neolithic fertile goddess, sort of a mother goddess from the prehistoric era. And so for this, Chicago wanted to use historically accurate techniques, including hand-spun wool to weave fabrics that were then sort of decorated with wool coils, fringe, and stitchwork. Some of the artists and volunteers learned to hand spin wool using a drop spindle, which is one of the first tools invented by women and what Neolithic women would have used to kind of transform wool into yarn, into textiles. So they learned to hand spin the wool. Others used hand looms to weave that hand spun wool into pieces that could then be stitched onto the linen runner. Another artist stewed and cleaned the femur of a cow to create bone needles, which the team used to stitch the final runner here. And then they attached them as sort of decoration, along with this small figurine, this small female figurine that sort of mimics the hundreds, if not thousands, of prehistoric female figurines that have been discovered throughout Europe. So Chicago and her collaborators' use of traditional women's art forms such as needlework, ceramics, and china painting really allowed them to further the knowledge of women's culture, heritage, and experiences throughout history. Chicago used her platform as a professional artist to elevate media that had been disregarded throughout art history and to acknowledge the women of the past who used such media. She also used core female imagery to reclaim the female body from the male gaze, to allow women to look at their own bodies with a sense of control and ownership, and to really help female viewers understand that simply having a vagina did not make them incapable or lesser than a man. The dinner party embodied the spirit of the 1970s feminist movement and provided a stage for traditional women's crafts to be elevated into the world of fine art, allowing women to learn about and celebrate their heritage and culture as well as their bodies and themselves. So many feminist artists embraced performance art as a powerful tool to challenge the traditional objectification of women's bodies in both art and reality. Ana Mendieta was a Cuban-born artist who was sent to Iowa in 1961 as part of Operation Peter Pan, the forced relocation of about 14,000 Cuban children after 1959 when Fidel Castro's communist regime took over the country. Traumatized by this and haunted by a sense of personal dislocation, Mendieta's work reveals a need for deeper connection to her physical surroundings. She was inspired by Joseph Bouygues and his performance works, as well as Afro-Cuban Santeria, natural elements, and biological cycles. Mendieta's works include ritualistic actions that sort of invoke spiritual redemption through communion with nature and the power of the feminine rooted within the earth. Her silhouette works, consisting of about 200 private performances in Iowa and Mexico, documented with photographs and film, involved the artist situating her body in various outdoor environments. So here we can see her on the ground, in front of a tree, against the side of a building, etc. And so she would kind of integrate her body within the environment and then use materials like mud, flowers, gunpowder, fire, sticks, etc. to sort of act upon the landscape and leave a trace or impression of her body. So for example, the one in the center here from her Tree of Life series shows the artist with her back against the trunk of a large tree, arms raised, and then she's kind of entirely covered in mud as if inviting the tree to absorb her and connect her to the earth as this maternal source of life. In this one on the end, it's an untitled work from her Silhouette series, and so here she's positioned herself within this sort of niche on the exterior of a church in a rather similar pose with her arms raised. And then she's arranged branches and sticks to sort of trace the shape of her silhouette and her presence and her interaction with the location. Sort of similarly on the left end, using these flowers to sort of integrate her body into the landscape itself. She called these works earth body works or sculptures, and said they were meant to visualize the dialogue between the human body and the land or natural environment. She also said, "Through my earth body sculptures, I become one with the earth. I become an extension of nature, and nature becomes an extension of my body. This obsessive act of reasserting my ties with the earth is really the reactivation of primeval beliefs. An omnipresent female force, the after-image of being encompasses with the womb, is a manifestation of my thirst for being." So very conceptual, these works. Another conceptual feminist artist who sort of directly explored the invisible daily experiences of women engaged in domestic labor was Mary Kelly. Her postpartum document is a monumental artwork that tracks the artist's changing relationship with her son from his birth through the first 6 years of his life, and it sort of documents her changing role as a mother. Although based on her personal life and experiences, Kelly described the work as, quote, "an interplay of voices, the mother's experience, feminist analysis, academic discussion, and political debate." The work includes some 135 objects, including photos, diagrams, printed transcripts, handwritten notes, scribbles, drawings, baby clothes, dirty diaper cloths, etc. And these are used as both record of her child's development and evidence of Kelly's sort of rigorous art-making process. Divided into 6 parts, each part focuses on key moments related to the child's development, such as learning to talk, her feelings of loss and change while watching him grow up, etc. And then she usually includes sort of detailed analytical text that that sort of exist in parallel to the objects and explain them or document them further. So here are a few examples of the objects that are included in postpartum document. And then here is the more specific example that your book includes. So this is from this is from one of the 6 parts called Documentation 3, Analyzed Markings and Diary Perspective Schema. And so on this particular work, or this particular unit, we'll say, Mary Kelly has included 3 types of text. So we have the first kind of column, which she describes as a condensed transcription of a child's conversation. The second column, she says, is a transcription of the mother's inner speech in relation to that first column, providing a picture of an adult's day-to-day interactions with the child. And then this third, slightly wider column here is a handwritten transcription describing Mary Kelly's own anxiety following an incident in which her son drank liquid aspirin and had to be rushed to the hospital, and just the difficulties of raising a child in general. Then over the top of all of that worry and analysis, are her son's drawings in kind of thick crayon. They are typical of the drawings made by a young child, not much more than scribbles on paper. However, his lines cut over his mother's careful work. Their carelessness seems all the more free when contrasted with her very sort of precise deliberations. What makes this piece important is the way in which motherhood, so often seen in art history as this sentimental connection between mother and child, instead here is shown as a difficult and complex relationship. Kelly's voice does not overbear her son's, instead it exists in tandem. We see Kelly developing and adapting in this work just as much as her child. The piece, Postpartum Document, is a central work within feminist art that is still a relevant and fascinating picture of what motherhood means for women. And although Postpartum Document has only been exhibited once in its entirety, Kelly has also published it as a book, underscoring how conceptual artists often rely on multiple formats to really communicate their ideas. So, although women contributed significantly to artistic developments in the 1960s and 70s, major museums and galleries continued to grant special status to work by male artists. In 1984, the Museum of Modern Art in New York sponsored a huge exhibition called An International Survey of Contemporary Painting and Sculpture, which claimed to highlight the period's most important artworks. The exhibition included about 169 mostly white artists, only 13 of which were women. Shortly after, in response, a group of feminist artists, curators, critics, historians, etc. in New York formed an activist group called the Guerrilla Girls that would, as they said, quote, function as the conscience of the art world. The group sought to expose gender and racial inequalities in the art world, stand against discrimination, and fight for rights of female artists and artists of color. They adapted tactics of guerrilla warfare, acting covertly to strike at the enemy. Their first campaign was to paste posters on walls throughout New York art districts, citing damning statistics of discrimination within the city's museums and galleries. Group members were anonymous, taking on the names of dead female artists as pseudonyms, and they wanted to do this to sort of counter the tendency of the art world to focus on the individual rather than collective accomplishment. To protect their identities during public events and protests, they wore gorilla masks, a play on the word guerrilla that reflects the group's use of humor to disarm critics and promote their message. So they wear guerrilla masks, but the name guerrilla is spelled like guerrilla warfare rather than the animal. They produced sharp, witty posters that really drew on advertising strategies. So this is one of their most famous posters, and it appropriates the reclining female nude figure from Ingres' Grand Odalisque that we looked at when we were talking about Romanticism. But they've given her a gorilla mask of her own. And then the headline, "Do Women Have to Be Naked to Get into the Met Museum?" So the poster here presents the findings of a survey of the Met's collection, which revealed that less than 5% of the artists in the museum were women, but 85% of the museum's nudes on display were female. The group repeated this survey in 2005, and they found that the number of women artists had only increased by 3%, which they humorously underscored by noting, well, at least there were more naked men. Here's another widely known Guerrilla Girls poster that delivers a sarcastic but sadly accurate list of the treatment afforded to women artists. The advantages of being a woman artist include things like working without the pressures of success, being reassured that whatever kind of art you make, it will be labeled feminine, not having to undergo the embarrassment of being called a genius, and getting your picture in art magazines wearing a gorilla suit. Feminist artists in the late 1970s and 80s continued to explore postmodern issues of power and the need to expose underlying social structures that oppress and marginalize others, often through appropriation. Barbara Kruger appropriates advertising and marketing techniques, as well as commercial imagery, to subvert the messages in mainstream mass media and instigate social change. Her early career as a graphic designer heavily influences her works, which are provocative photo montages that juxtapose words and images to challenge expected meanings that we get from our experiences with pop culture and advertising. Kruger has noted, quote, "I think there is an accessibility to pictures and words that we have learned to read very fluently through advertising and through the technological development of photography and film and video." So one example of her work is this 1981 untitled "Your Gaze Hits the Side of My Face," which presents a cropped and enlarged black and white printed image of a female mannequin framed within an advertising context. Although the pronouns in the text are ambiguous of gender, the prominence of the female mannequin's appearance directly connects Kruger's work to the postmodern theory of the male gaze, which was much discussed in the 70s and 80s, and addresses how most images of women reinforce unequal power relationships between men and women, even if they don't intend to, because women are commonly seen or interpreted as passive, helpless sexual beings for hetero male consumption. The use of a mannequin rather than a real woman is a literal illustration of this objectification. Kruger's wording is also important here by saying your gaze hits the side of my face rather than the gaze or the face. She's addressing the viewer directly and kind of forcing us to acknowledge the relationship between the viewer and the viewed. In this case, the viewer is sort of directly related to a consumer who looks at an object of desire for purchase, and so we're really being asked to think about our role and responsibility as a viewer and the effects of viewing and objectification on women. Here's another example of her work, this time untitled Your Body is a Battleground from 1989, which Kruger designed for a pro-choice rally in Washington, D.C. to protest a string of anti-abortion laws that undermined the 1973 Roe v. Wade decision. So the background here is a photographic image of a woman's face, presumably taken, again, from like mass media advertising. But her face is split vertically into symmetrical halves with the positive and negative of the black and white image. Red words are splashed across the image. Your body is a battleground. Kruger says, quote, I think that it's important for me to somehow, through a collection of words and images, try to picture or objectify or visualize how it might feel sometimes to be alive today. And she's thinking specifically about, how it feels as a woman to be alive today. And so her works are often both, art and protest, and they are typically sort of tied to a specific moment in time, but the power is timeless, and the messages have just as much resonance today as they did then. So another feminist artist, Cindy Sherman, used photography allied with performance to engage in a postmodern critique of society. In the late 1970s, Sherman began her Untitled Film Stills series, in which she cast herself as the star of an ongoing, inexhaustibly inventive series of still photographs that are meant as one-frame movies. Using costumes, makeup, wigs, props, lighting, and settings, Sherman sought to reference and subvert the stereotypical roles played by women in films, television, and commercials of the 1950s and 60s. So although each untitled image stands alone, they come together to represent women's collective stories. She says they're not meant as self-portraits, but rather that she's trying to make other people recognize themselves rather than me. For example, in Untitled Film Still number 21, Sherman created a narrative and assumed the role of a small-town girl recently arrived in the big city. The image itself focuses on her face, and something off-screen has seemingly caught her attention, but her expression is unsure, and so there's this sort of ominous feeling. Others show her in roles such as the hardworking housewife, the femme fatale, the teenage runaway, and, other stereotypical female archetypes. She does tend to maintain a certain level of ambiguity within the photos, though. For example, number 35 here kind of shows her as a hardworking housewife wearing an apron with her hair wrapped in a scarf. The scuffs on the door and the wall imply the possibility of violence, maybe underscoring the terrors of domestic life. And her serious expression and somewhat sassy pose standing near the door and the coat rack suggests that perhaps the woman has, had enough, she's fed up, and she's leaving. But it's really unclear if that's the case or if instead maybe she's just returned home from running errands or something. Really, with these untitled film stills, Sherman is commenting on womanhood and how it oftentimes becomes a performance. By forcing the viewer to acknowledge the illusion of her images, Sherman underscores the power of visual representation to construct female identity and alludes to the performances that we enact in everyday life. Through her masquerading, she's also saying that identity is not necessarily fixed, which is an idea that can be liberating, but it's somewhat ironic because she often takes on these ultra-feminine, vulnerable, or submissive roles. Later, Sherman continued to photograph herself in various costumes, disguises, and roles to examine women's roles not only in film, but in history and contemporary society as well. So, for example, in Untitled number 193 from 1989, Sherman presents herself as an 18th century French aristocratic woman, reclining on a bed of lavish blue silks, dressed in this elegant white gown. To the left, we have this ball of yarn and crochet needles, which are meant to reference the domestic realm. And then to the right side, we have this huge fake foot that pokes out from under her dress, underscoring the sort of fakery of the entire image. Again, she's thinking about gender and class as performative and artificial, and as being defined and controlled by social conventions, history, the media, etc.